He Rode to Makkah. By Muhammad Asad. 5. Spirit and Flesh, Section 1-5. 1. Days pass, and the nights are short, and we ride southward at a brisk pace. Our dromedaries are in excellent shape, they have recently been watered, and the last 2 days have provided them with abundant pasture. There are still 14 days between here and Mecca, and even more if, as is probable, we spend some time in the towns of Hale and Medina, both which lie on our route. An unusual impatience has taken hold of me, an urgency for which I know no explanation. Hitherto I have been wont to enjoy traveling at leisure, with no particular urge to reach my destination quickly. The days and weeks spent in journey had each of them a fulfillment of its own, and the goal always seemed to be incidental. But now I have begun to feel what I have never felt before in my years in Arabia, an impatience to reach the end of the road. What end? To see Mecca? I have been to the holy city so often, and know its life so thoroughly, that it no longer holds out any promise of new discoveries. Or is it perhaps a new kind of discovery that I am anticipating? It must be so, for I am being drawn to Mecca by a strange, personal expectancy, as if this spiritual center of the Muslim world, with its multinational congregation of people from all comers of the earth, were a kind of promise, a gateway to a wider world than the one in which I am now living. Not that I have grown tired of Arabia. No. I love its deserts, its towns, the ways of its people as I have always loved them. That first hint of Arabian life in the Sinai desert some 10 years ago has never been disappointed. And the succeeding years have only confirmed my original expectation, but since my night at the well 2 days ago, the conviction has grown within me that Arabia has given me all that it had to give. I am strong, young, healthy. I can ride for many hours at a stretch without being unduly tired. I can travel, and have been doing so for years, like a Bedouin, without a tent and without any of the small comforts which the townspeople of Najd often regard as indispensable on long desert journeys. I am at home in all the little crafts of Bedouin life, and have adopted, almost imperceptibly, the manners and habits of a Najdi Arab. But is this all there is to be? Have I lived so long in Arabia only to become an Arab? Or was it perhaps a preparation for something that is yet to come? The impatience which I now feel is somehow akin to the turbulent impatience I experienced when I returned to Europe after my first journey to the Near East. The feeling of having been forced to stop short of a tremendous revelation that could have revealed itself to me if only there had been more time. The initial impact of crossing from the Arabian world back into Europe had been somewhat softened by the months spent in Turkey after I had left Syria in the autumn of 1923. Mustafa Kemal's Turkey had in those days not yet entered into its reformist, imitative phrase. It was still genuinely Turkish in its life and traditions, and thus, because of the unifying bond of its Islamic faith, was still related to the general tenor of Arabian life, but Turkey's inner rhythm seemed somehow heavier, less transparent, less airy, and more occidental. When I traveled overland from Istanbul to Sofia and Belgrade, there was no abrupt transition from east to west. The images changed gradually, one element receding and another imperceptibly taking its place, the minarets growing fewer and farther between. The long kaftans of the men giving way to belted peasant blouses, the scattered trees and groves of Anatolia merging into Serbian fir forests, until suddenly, at the Italian frontier, I found myself back in Europe. As I sat in the train that was taking me from Trieste to Vienna, my recent impressions of Turkey began to lose all their vividness, and the only reality that remained was the 18 months I had spent in Arab countries. It almost gave me a shock to realize that I was looking upon the once so familiar European scenery with the eyes of a stranger. The people seemed so ugly, their movements angular and clumsy, with no direct relationship to what they really felt and wanted, and all at once I knew that in spite of the outward appearance of purpose in all they did, they were living, without being aware of it, in a world of make-believe. Obviously, my contact with the Arabs had utterly, irretrievably changed my approach to what I considered essential in life. And it was with something like astonishment that I remembered that other Europeans had experienced Arabian life before me. How was it possible, then, that they had not experienced this same shock of discovery? Or, had they? Had perhaps one or another of them been as shaken to his depths as I was now? It was years later, in Arabia, that I received an answer to this question. It came from Dr. van der Meulen, then Dutch minister at Jeddah. A man of wide and many-sided culture, he clung to his Christian faith with a fervor nowadays rare among Westerners and was thus, understandably, not a friend of Islam as a religion. Nonetheless, he confessed to me, he loved Arabia more than any other country he had known, not excepting his own. When his service in the Hijaz was approaching its end, he once said to me, "I believe no sensitive person can ever remain immune to the enchantment of Arabian life, or pull it out of his heart after living among the Arabs for a time. When one goes away, one will forever carry within oneself the atmosphere of this desert land, and will always look back to it with longing, even if one's home is in richer, more beautiful regions." I stopped for a few weeks in Vienna and celebrated a reconciliation with my father. By now he had got over his anger at my abandonment of my university studies and the unceremonious manner in which I had left his roof. After all, I was now a correspondent of the Frankfurter Zeitung, a name that people in Central Europe used to pronounce almost with awe in those days, and had thus justified my boastful claim that I would come out on top. From Vienna I proceeded straight to Frankfurt to present myself in person to the newspaper for which I had been writing for well over a year. I did this with a great deal of self-assurance. For the letters from Frankfurt had made it evident that my work was appreciated, and it was with a feeling of having definitely arrived that I entered the somber, old-fashioned edifice of the Frankfurter Zeitung and sent up my card to the editor-in-chief, the internationally famous Dr. Heinrich Simon. When I came in, he looked at me for a moment in speechless astonishment, almost forgetting to get up from his chair, but soon he regained his composure, rose and shook hands with me. "Sit down, sit down. I have been expecting you." But he continued to stare at me in silence until I began to feel uncomfortable. "Is there anything wrong, Dr. Simon?" "No, no, nothing is wrong, or, rather, everything is wrong." And then he laughed and went on, "I somehow had expected to meet a man of middle age with gold-rimmed spectacles, and now I find a boy. Oh, I beg your pardon, how old are you, anyway?" I suddenly recalled the jovial Dutch merchant in Cairo who had asked me the same question the year before, and I burst out laughing. "I am over 23, sir, nearly 24. And then I added, "Do you find it too young for the Frankfurter Zeitung?" "No," replied Simon slowly, "not for the Frankfurter Zeitung, but for your articles." I somehow took it for granted that only a much older man would be able to overcome his natural desire for self-assertion and leave his own personality, as you have been doing, entirely in the background of his writings. That, as you know, is the secret of mature journalism, to write objectively about what you see and hear and think without relating those experiences directly to your own personal experiences. On the other hand, now that I think of it, only a very young man could have written with so much enthusiasm, so much, how shall I say, so much thrill. Then he sighed, "I do hope that it doesn't wear off and you don't become as smug and jaded as the rest of them." The discovery of my extreme youth seemed to have strengthened Dr. Simon's conviction that he had found in me a highly promising correspondent, and he fully agreed that I should return to the Middle East as soon as possible, the sooner the better. Financially, there was no longer any obstacle to such a plan, for the German inflation had at last been overcome and the stabilization of currency had brought almost immediately a wave of prosperity in its wake. The Frankfurter Zeitung was once again in a position to finance the journeys of its special correspondents. Before I could go out again, however, I was expected to produce the book for which the newspaper had originally contracted me, and it was decided that during this time I should be attached to the editorial office in order to acquire a thorough knowledge of the workings of a great newspaper. Despite my impatience to go abroad again, those months in Frankfurt were tremendously stimulating. The Frankfurter Zeitung was not just a large newspaper, it was almost a research institute. It employed about 45 full-fledged editors, not counting the many sub-editors and assistants in the newsrooms. The editorial work was highly specialized, with every area of the world and every major political or economic subject entrusted to an outstanding expert in his field. And this in pursuance of an old tradition that the articles and dispatches of the Frankfurter Zeitung should be not merely ephemeral reflections of passing events but, rather, a kind of documentary evidence which politicians and historians might draw upon. It was common knowledge that in the Foreign Office in Berlin the editorials and political analyses of the Frankfurter Zeitung were filed with the same reverence that was accorded the notes verbals of foreign governments. In fact, Bismarck is quoted to have once said of the then chief of the newspaper's Berlin Bureau, Dr. Stein is the ambassador of the Frankfurter Zeitung to the court of Berlin. To be a member of such an organization was very gratifying indeed to a man of my age. The more so as my hesitant views about the Middle East were met with serious attention by the editors and often became the subject of the daily editorial conferences, and the final triumph came on the day when I was asked to write an editorial on a current Middle Eastern problem. My work at the Frankfurter Zeitung gave a strong impetus to my conscious thinking. With greater clarity than ever before, I began to relate my Eastern experiences to the Western world of which I was once again a part. Just as some months earlier I had discovered a connection between the emotional security of the Arabs and the faith they professed, it now began to dawn upon me that Europe's lack of inner integration and the chaotic state of its ethics might be an outcome of its loss of contact with the religious faith that had shaped Western civilization. Here, I saw, was a society in search of a new spiritual orientation after it had abandoned God, but apparently very few Westerners realized what it was all about. The majority seemed to think, consciously or subconsciously, more or less along these lines. Since our reason, our scientific experiments and our calculations do not reveal anything definite about the origin of human life and its destinies after bodily death, we ought to concentrate all our energies on the development of our material and intellectual potential and not allow ourselves to be hampered by transcendental ethics and moral postulates based on assumptions which defy scientific proof. Thus, while Western society did not expressly deny God, it simply no longer had room for him in its intellectual system. In earlier years, after I had become disappointed with the religion of my ancestors, I had given some thought to Christianity. In my eyes, the Christian concept of God was infinitely superior to that of the Old Testament in that it did not restrict God's concern to any one group of people but postulated his fatherhood of all mankind. There was, however, an element in the Christian religious view that detracted from the universality of its approach, the distinction it made between the soul and the body, the world of faith and the world of practical affairs. Owing to its early divorce from all tendencies aiming at an affirmation of life and of worldly endeavors, Christianity, I felt, had long ceased to provide a moral impetus to Western civilization. its adherents had grown accustomed to the idea that it was not the business of religion to interfere with practical life. They were content to regard religious faith as a soothing convention, meant to foster no more than a vague sense of personal morality, especially sexual morality, in individual men and women. In this they were assisted by the age-old attitude of a church which, in pursuance of the principle of a division between that which is God's and that which is Caesar's, had left the entire field of social and economic activities almost untouched, with the result that Christian politics and business had developed in a direction entirely different from all that Christ had envisaged. In not providing its followers with a concrete guidance in worldly affairs, the religion which the Western world professed had failed in what, to me, appeared to have been the true mission of Christ and, indeed, the cardinal task of every religion, to show man not merely how to feel but also how to live rightly. With an instinctive feeling of having been somehow let down by his religion, Western man had, over the centuries, lost all his real faith in Christianity. With the loss of this faith, he had lost the conviction that the universe was an expression of one planning mind and thus formed one organic whole, and because he had lost that conviction, he was now living in a spiritual and moral vacuum. In the West's gradual falling away from Christianity, I saw a revolt against the Pauline life contempt that had so early, and so completely, obscured the teachings of Christ. How, then, could Western society still claim to be a Christian society? And how could it hope, without a concrete faith, to overcome its present moral chaos? A world in upheaval and convulsion, that was our Western world. Bloodshed, destruction, violence on an unprecedented scale, the breakdown of so many social conventions, a clash of ideologies, an embittered, all-round fight for new ways of life, these were the signs of our time. Out of the smoke and the shambles of a world war, innumerable smaller wars and a host of revolutions and counter-revolutions. Out of economic disasters that transcended anything until then recorded, out of all these tremendous happenings emerged the truth that the present-day Western concentration on material, technical progress could never by itself resolve the existing chaos into something resembling order. My instinctive, youthful conviction that man does not live by bread alone crystallized into the intellectual conviction that the current adoration of progress was no more than a weak, shadowy substitute for an earlier faith in absolute values, a pseudo-faith devised by people who had lost all inner strength to believe in absolute values and were now deluding themselves with the belief that somehow, by mere evolutionary impulse, man would outgrow his present difficulties. I did not see how any of the new economic systems that stemmed from this illusory faith could possibly constitute more than a palliative for Western society's misery. They could, at best, cure some of its symptoms, but never the cause. While I worked on the editorial staff of the Frankfurter Zeitung, I paid frequent visits to Berlin, where most of my friends resided, and it was on one of those trips that I met the woman who was later to become my wife. From the moment I was introduced to Elsa amidst the bustle of the Romanisches Café, I was strongly attracted, not only by the delicate beauty of her appearance, her narrow, fine-boned face with its serious, deep blue eyes and the sensitive mouth that bespoke humor and kindness, but even more by the inward, sensually intuitive quality of her approach to people and things. She was a painter. Her work, which I later came to know, may not have been outstanding, but it bore the same imprint of serene intensity that expressed itself in all her words and gestures. Although she was some 15 years older than I, that is, in her late 30s, her smooth face and slender, flexible body gave her a much younger appearance. She was probably the finest representative of the pure Nordic type I have ever encountered, having all its clearness and sharpness of outline with none of the angularity and stolidity that so often goes with it. She descended from one of those old Holstein families which might be described as the North German equivalent of the English yeomanry. But the unconventional freedom of her manner had caused the yeoman earthiness to give way to a quite un-Nordic warmth and flair. She was a widow and had a 6-year-old son, to whom she was greatly devoted. The attraction must have been mutual from the very outset, for after that first meeting we saw each other very often. Filled as I was with my recent impressions of the Arab world, I naturally communicated them to Elsa. And she, unlike most of my other friends, displayed an extraordinary understanding and sympathy for the strong but as yet inchoate feelings and ideas which these impressions had produced in me. So much so that when I wrote a kind of introduction to the book in which I was describing my Near Eastern travels, I felt as if I were addressing myself to her. When a European travels in any country of Europe which he has never seen before, he continues to move within his own, though perhaps somewhat widened, environment and can easily grasp the difference between the things that habit has made familiar to him and the newness that now comes his way. For, whether we are Germans or Englishmen, and whether we travel through France, Italy, or Hungary, the spirit of Europe unifies us all. Living as we do within a well-defined orbit of associations, we are able to understand one another and to make ourselves understood through those associations as if through a common language. We call this phenomenon community of culture. Its existence is undoubtedly an advantage. But like all advantages that stem from habit, this one is occasionally a disadvantage as well. For sometimes we find that we are wrapped up in that universal spirit as if in cotton wool, that we are lulled by it into a laziness of the heart, that it has made us forget the tightrope walk of our earlier, more creative times, that reaching out after intangible realities. In those earlier times they would perhaps have been called intangible possibilities, and the men who went out in search of them, whether discoverers or adventurers or creative artists, were always seeking only the innermost springs of their own lives. We latecomers are also seeking our own lives, but we are obsessed by the desire to secure our own life before it unfolds itself. And we dimly suspect the sin that lies hidden in such endeavor. Many Europeans begin to feel it today, the terrible danger of avoiding dangers. In this book I am describing a journey into a region whose difference from Europe is too great to be easily bridged, and difference is, in a way, akin to danger. We are leaving the security of our too uniform environment, in which there is little that is unfamiliar and nothing that is surprising, and entering into the tremendous strangenesses of another world. Let us not deceive ourselves. In that other world we may perhaps comprehend this or that of the many colorful impressions that come our way, but we can never, as we might in the case of a Western country, consciously grasp the total picture. It is more than space that separates us from the people of that other world. How to communicate with them? It is not enough to speak their language. In order to comprehend their feel of life one would have to enter into their environment fully and begin to live within their associations. Is this possible? And, would it be desirable? It might be, after all, a bad bargain to exchange our old, familiar habits of thought for strange, unfamiliar ones. But are we really excluded from that world? I do not think so. Our feeling of exclusion rests mainly on an error peculiar to our Western way of thinking. We are wont to underestimate the creative value of the unfamiliar and are always tempted to do violence to it, to appropriate it, to take it over, on our own terms, into our own intellectual environment. It seems to me, however, that our age of disquiet no longer permits such cavalier attempts. Many of us are beginning to realize that cultural distance can, and should, be overcome by means other than intellectual rape. It might perhaps be overcome by surrendering our senses to it. Because this unfamiliar world is so entirely different from all that you have known at home. Because it offers so much that is strikingly strange in image and sound, it brushes you sometimes, if you permit yourself to be attentive, with a momentary remembrance of things long known and long forgotten, those intangible realities of your own life. And when this breath of remembrance reaches you from beyond the abyss that separates your world from that other, that unfamiliar one, you ask yourself whether it is not perhaps herein, and only herein, that the meaning of all wandering lies, to become aware of the strangeness of the world around you and thereby to reawaken your own, personal, forgotten reality. And because Elsa intuitively understood what I tried so inadequately, like one who gropes in darkness, to convey in these stammering words, I strongly felt that she, and she alone, could understand what I was after and could help me in my search. 2. Another day of wandering is over. There is silence within me, and the night is silent around me. The wind glides softly over the dunes and ripples the sand on their slopes. In the narrow circle of the firelight I can see Zaid's figure busy over his pots and pans, our saddlebags lying nearby where we tossed them when we made camp for the night, and our saddles with their high wooden pommels. A little beyond, already melting into the darkness, the crouching bodies of the two dromedaries, tired after the long march, their necks stretched on the sand, and still farther beyond, only faintly visible under the starlight, but as near to you as your own heartbeat, the empty desert. There are many more beautiful landscapes in the world, but none, I think, that can shape man's spirit in so sovereign a way. In its hardness and sparseness, the desert strips our desire to comprehend life of all subterfuges, of all the manifold delusions with which a more bountiful nature may entrap man's mind and cause him to project his own imageries into the world around him. The desert is bare and clean and knows no compromise. It sweeps out of the heart of man all the lovely fantasies that could be used as a masquerade for wishful thinking, and thus makes him free to surrender himself to an absolute that has no image, the farthest of all that is far and yet the nearest of all that is near. Ever since man began to think, the desert has been the cradle of all his beliefs in one God. True. Even in softer environments and more favorable climes have men had, time and again, an inkling of his existence and oneness. As, for instance, in the ancient Greek concept of Moira, the indefinable power behind and above the Olympian gods, but such concepts were never more than the outcome of a vague feeling, a divining rather than certain knowledge, until the knowledge broke forth with dazzling certainty to men of the desert and from out of the desert. It was from a burning thorn bush in the desert of Midian that the voice of God rang out to Moses. It was in the wilderness of the Judean desert that Jesus received the message of the kingdom of God, and it was in the cave of Hira, in the desert hills near Mecca, that the first call came to Muhammad of Arabia. It came to him in that narrow, dry gorge between rocky hills, that naked valley burnt by the desert sun, an all-embracing yes to life, both of the spirit and of the fiasib. The call that was destined to give form and purpose to a formless nation of tribes and, through it, to spread within a few decades, like a flame and a promise, westward as far as the Atlantic Ocean and eastward to the Great Wall of China. Destined to remain a great spiritual power to this day, more than 13 centuries later, outliving all political decay, outlasting even the great civilization which it brought into being, the call that came to the Prophet of Arabia. I sleep and I awake. I think of the days that have passed and yet are not dead, and sleep again and dream, and awake again and sit up, dream and remembrance flowing gently together in the half-light of my awakening. The night is near to morning. The fire has died down entirely. Rolled in his blanket sleeps Zaid, our dromedaries lie motionless, like two mounds of earth. The stars are still visible, and you might think there is still time to sleep, but low on the eastern sky there appears, palely born out of the darkness, a faint streak of light above another, darker streak that lies over the horizon, twin heralds of dawn, time of the morning prayer. Obliquely over me I see the morning star, which the Arabs call Az-Zahra, the shining one. If you ask them about it, they will tell you that the shining one was once a woman. There were once two angels, Harut and Marut, who forgot to be humble, as it behoves angels to be, and boasted of their invincible purity. We are made of light, we are above all sin and desire, unlike the weak sons of man, sons of a mother's dark womb. But they forgot that their purity had not come from their own strength, for they were pure only because they knew no desire and had never been called upon to resist it. Their arrogance displeased the Lord, and he said to them, "Go down to earth and stand your test there." The proud angels went down to earth and wandered, clothed in human bodies, among the sons of man. And on the very first night they came upon a woman whose beauty was so great that people called her the Shining One. When the two angels looked at her with the human eyes and feelings they now had, they became confused and, just as if they had been sons of man, the desire to possess her arose in them. Each of them said to her, "Be willing unto me," but the Shining One answered, "There is a man to whom I belong, if you want me, you must free me of him." And they slew the man, and with the unjustly spilt blood still on their hands, they satisfied their burning lust with the woman. But as soon as the desire left them, the two erstwhile angels became aware that on their first night on earth they had sinned twofold, in murder and fornication, and that there had been no sense in their pride. And the Lord said, "Choose between punishment in this world and punishment in the hereafter." In their bitter remorse, the fallen angels chose punishment in this world, and the Lord ordained that they be suspended on chains between heaven and earth and remain thus suspended until the day of judgment as a warning to angels and men that all virtue destroys itself if it loses humility. But as no human eye can see angels, God changed the Shining One into a star in the heavens so that people might always see her and, remembering her story, remember the fate of Harut and Marut. The outline of this legend is much older than Islam. It seems to have originated in one of the many myths which the ancient Semites wove around their goddess Ishtar, the Grecian Aphrodite of later days, both of whom were identified with the planet we now call Venus. But in the form in which I heard it, the story of Harut and Marut is a typical creation of the Muslim mind. An illustration of the idea that abstract purity, or freedom from sin, can have no moral meaning so long as it is based on a mere absence of urges and desires, for is not the recurrent necessity of choosing between right and wrong the premise of all morality? Poor Harut and Marut did not know this, because as angels they had never been exposed to temptation. They had considered themselves pure and morally far above man, not realizing that the denial of the legitimacy of bodily urges would indirectly imply a denial of all moral value in human endeavors. For it is only the presence of urges, temptations, and conflicts, the possibility of choice, which makes man, and him alone, into a moral being, a being endowed with a soul. It is on the basis of this conception that Islam, alone among all higher religions, regards the soul of man as one aspect of his personality and not as an independent phenomenon in its own right. Consequently, to the Muslim, man's spiritual growth is inextricably bound up with all the other aspects of his nature. Physical urges are an integral part of this nature, not the result of an original sin, a concept foreign to the ethics of Islam, but positive, God-given forces, to be accepted and sensibly used as such. Hence, the problem for man is not how to suppress the demands of his body but, rather, how to coordinate them with the demands of his spirit in such a way that life might become full and righteous. The root of this almost monistic life assertion is to be found in the Islamic view that man's original nature is essentially good. Contrary to the Christian idea that man is born sinful, or the teaching of Hinduism that he is originally low and impure and must painfully stagger through a long chain of incarnations toward the ultimate goal of perfection. The Quran says, "Verily, we create man in a perfect state, a state of purity that may be destroyed only by subsequent wrong behavior, and thereupon we reduce him to the lowest of low, with the exception of those who have faith in God and do good works." 3. The palm orchards of Hale lie before us. We halt by the side of an old, ruined watchtower to prepare ourselves for our entry into the town, for old Arabian custom, always concerned with personal aesthetics, demands of the traveler that he enter a town in his best attire, fresh and clean as if he had just mounted his dromedary. And so we utilize our remaining water for washing our hands and faces, clip our neglected beards and pull our whitest tunics from the saddlebags. We brush the weeks of desert dust from our abayas and from the gaily colored tassels of our saddlebags and dress our camels in their best finery, and now we are ready to present ourselves in Hale. This town is far more Arabian than, say, Baghdad or Medina. It does not contain any elements from non-Arab countries and peoples. It is pure and unadulterated like a bowl of freshly drawn milk. No foreign dress is visible in the bazaar, only loose Arabian abayas, kafiyas and eagles. The streets are much cleaner than those in any other city of the Middle East, cleaner even than any other town in Najd, which is noted for its un-Eastern cleanliness, probably because the people of this land, having always been free, have retained a greater measure of self-respect than elsewhere in the East. The houses, built of horizontal layers of packed mud, are in good repair, with the exception of the demolished city walls which bear witness to the last war between Ibn Saud and the house of Ibn Rashid and of Ibn Saud's conquest of the town in 1921. The hammers of the coppersmiths pound into shape all manner of vessels, the saws of the carpenters bite shrinkingly into wood, shoemakers tap the soles of sandals. Camels loaded with fuel and skins full of butter make their way through the crowds. Other camels, brought in by Bedouins for sale, fill the air with their bellowing. Gaudy saddlebags from Al-Hassa are being fingered by experienced hands. The auctioneers, an ever-recurring fixture in any Arabian town, move up and down the bazaar and, with loud cries, offer their goods for sale. Here and there you can see hunting falcons jumping up and down on their wooden perches, tethered by thin leather thongs. Honey-colored Sahikai hounds stretch their graceful limbs lazily in the sun. Thin Bedouins in worn abayas, well-dressed servants and bodyguards of the Amir, almost all of them from the southern provinces, mingle with traders from Baghdad, Basra and Kuwait and the natives of Hale. These natives, that is, the men, for of the women you see hardly more than the black abaya which conceals head and body, belong to one of the most handsome races in the world. All the grace of appearance and movement to which the Arab nation has ever attained seems to be embodied in this tribe of Shamir, of which the pre-Islamic poets sang, "In the highlands live the men of steel and the proud, chaste women." When we arrive before the Emir's castle, where we intend to spend the next 2 days, we find our host holding court in the open outside the castle gates. Amir ibn Musaid belongs to the Jilawi branch of the house of Ibn Saud and is a brother-in-law of the king. One of the most powerful of the king's governors, he is called Amir of the North because he holds sway not only over the Jabal Shamir province but over the whole of northern Najd up to the confines of Syria and Iraq, an area almost as large as France. The Amir, who is an old friend of mine, and a few Bedouin sheikhs from the steppes are sitting on the long, narrow brick bench built along the castle wall. In a long row at their feet crouch Ibn Musaid's Rajajal. The men at arms with rifles and silver-sheathed scimitars who never leave him throughout the day. Not so much for protection as for prestige, next to them, the falconers with their birds perched on gloved fists, lower servants, Bedouins, a throng of retainers, great and small, down to the stable boys, all feeling equal to one another as men in spite of the differences in their stations. And how could it be otherwise in this land where you never address anyone as my lord, except God in prayer? Facing them in a large semicircle squat the many Bedouins and townspeople who are bringing their complaints and quarrels before the Amir for settlement. We make our camels lie down outside the circle, hand them over to the care of a couple of retainers who have rushed over to us and proceed toward the Amir. He rises, and all who have been sitting by his side on the bench and on the ground before him rise with him. He stretches his hand toward us. Alan wa Salan, and may God grant you life. I kiss the Amir on the tip of his nose and his forehead, and he kisses me on both cheeks and pulls me to the bench by his side. Zayd finds a place among the Rajajal. Ibn Muzid introduces me to his other guests. Some of the faces are new to me and some are familiar from previous years. Among these is Gadban ibn Rimal, Supreme Sheikh of the Sinjara Shamar, that delightful old warrior whom I always call uncle. Nobody would guess from his almost tattered appearance that he is one of the mightiest chieftains of the north, and has so loaded his young wife with gold and jewels that, according to popular belief, 2 slave maidens have to support her when she wants to leave her huge tent which rests on 16 poles. His eyes twinkle as he embraces me and whispers into my ear, "No new wife yet?" To which I can only reply with a smile and a shrug. Amir ibn Muzid must have overheard this quip, for he laughs aloud and says, "It is coffee and not wives that a tired traveler needs," and calls out, "Kawa! Kawa!" Repeats the servant nearest the Amir, and the one at the farthest end of the row takes up the call, "Kawa!" And so on until the ceremonious command reaches the castle gate and re-echoes from within. In no time a servant appears bearing the traditional brass coffee pot in his left hand and several small cups in his right hand. Pours out the first for the Amir, the second for me, and then serves the other guests in the order of their rank. The cup is refilled once or twice, and when a guest indicates he has had enough, it is filled again and passed on to the next man. The Amir is apparently curious to know the results of my journey to the frontier of Iraq, but he betrays his interest only in brief questions as to what befell me on the way, reserving a fuller inquiry until we are alone. Then he resumes the judicial hearing which my arrival has interrupted. Such an informal court of justice would be inconceivable in the West. The Amir, as ruler and judge, is of course assured of all respect, but there is no trace of subservience in the respect which the Bedouins show him. Each of the plaintiffs and defendants proudly rests in the consciousness of his free humanity. Their gestures are not hesitant. Their voices are often loud and assertive, and everyone speaks to the Amir as to an elder brother, calling him, as is Bedouin custom with the king himself, by his first name and not by his title. There is no trace of haughtiness in Ibn Muzid's bearing. His handsome face with its short, black beard, his middle-sized, somewhat stocky figure speak of that unstudied self-restraint and easy dignity which in Arabia so often goes hand in hand with great power. He is grave and curt. With authoritative words he immediately decides the simpler cases and refers the more complicated ones, which require learned jurisprudence, to the Qadi of the district. It is not easy to be the supreme authority in a great Bedouin region. An intimate knowledge of the various tribes, family relationships, leading personalities, tribal grazing areas, past history, and present idiosyncrasies is needed to hit upon the correct solution in the excited complexity of a Bedouin plaint. Tact of heart is as important here as sharpness of intellect, and both must work together with needlepoint precision in order to avoid a mistake, for in the same way as Bedouins never forget a favor done to them, they never forget a judicial decision which they consider unjust. On the other hand, a just decision is almost always accepted with good grace even by those against whom it has gone. Ibn Muzid measures up to these requirements probably better than any other of Ibn Saud's Amirs. He is so rounded, so quiet and so without inner contradictions that his instinct almost always shows him the right way whenever his reason reaches a dead end. He is a swimmer in life. He lets himself be borne by the waters and masters them by adapting himself to them. Two ragged Bedouins are now presenting their quarrel before him with excited words and gestures. Bedouins are, as a rule, difficult to deal with. There is always something unpredictable in them, a sensitive excitability which knows no compromise, always heaven and hell close to each other. But now I can see how Ibn Muzid parts their seething passions and smooths them with his quiet words. One might think he would order the one to be silent while the other pleads for what he claims to be his right, but no, he lets them talk both at the same time. Outs out each other, and only occasionally steps in with a little word here and a question there, to be immediately submerged in their passionate arguments. He gives in, and seemingly retreats, only to cut in again a little later with an appropriate remark. It is an entrancing spectacle, this adaptation of the judge's own mind to a reality so conflictingly interpreted by two angry men, not so much a search for truth in a juridical sense as the slow unveiling of a hidden, objective reality. The Amir approaches this goal by fits and starts. Draws out the truth, as if by a thin string, slowly and patiently, almost imperceptibly to both plaintiff and defendant, until they suddenly stop, look at each other in puzzlement, and realize, judgment has been delivered, a judgment so obviously just that it requires no further explanation. Whereupon one of the two stands up hesitantly, straightens his abaya and tugs his erstwhile opponent by the sleeve in an almost friendly manner, "Come," and both retreat, still somewhat bewildered and at the same time relieved, mumbling the blessing of peace over the Amir. The scene is wonderful. A real piece of art, a prototype, it seems to me, of that fruitful collaboration between jurisprudence and justice which in Western courts and parliaments is still in its infancy, but stands here in all its perfection in the dusty market square before the castle of an Arab Amir. Ibn Muzid, reclining indolently against the mud wall, takes up the next case. His face, strong, furrowed, looking out of deepest eyes which warm and pierce, is the face of a real leader of men, a masterly representative of the greatest quality of his race, common sense of the heart. Some of the others present obviously feel a similar admiration. A man sitting on the ground before me, he is a Bedouin of the tribe of Harb and one of the Emir's men-at-arms, cranes his neck up toward me with a smile on his face. Is he not like that Sultan of whom Mutanabi says? I met him when his gleaming sword was sheathed. I saw him when it streamed with blood. And always found him best of all mankind. But best of all in him was still his noble mind. It does not strike me as incongruous to hear an unlettered Bedouin quote verses of a great Arabian poet who lived in the 10th century, certainly not as incongruous as it would have been to hear a Bavarian peasant quote Goethe or an English stevedore William Blake or Shelley. 4. Despite the more general spread of education in the West, the highlights of Western culture are not really shared by the average European or American, while, on the other hand, very wide segments of uneducated and sometimes even illiterate Muslims do share consciously, daily, in the cultural achievements of their past. Just as this Bedouin here has been able to call to mind an appropriate verse from Mutanabi to illustrate a situation of which he was a witness. Many a ragged Persian without schooling, a water carrier, a porter in a bazaar, a soldier in an outlying frontier post, carries in his memory innumerable verses of Hafiz or Jami or Ferdowsi and weaves them with evident enjoyment into his everyday conversation. Although they have largely lost that creativeness which made their cultural heritage so great, these Muslim people have even now a direct, living contact with its summits. I still remember the day when I made this discovery in the bazaar of Damascus. I was holding in my hands a vessel, a large bowl of baked clay. It had a strangely solemn shape. Big and round. Like a somewhat flattened sphere of almost musical proportions. Out of the roundness of its wall, which had in it the tenderness of a woman's cheek, two handles bent outward in perfect curves that would have done honor to a Greek amphora. They had been kneaded by hand. I could still discern the fingerprints of a humble potter in the clay. Around the vessel's inward turned rim he had etched with swift, sure strokes of his stylus a delicate arabesque like the hint of a rose garden in bloom. He had been working quickly, almost negligently when he created this splendid simplicity which brought to mind all the glories of Seljuk and Persian pottery one so admires in the museums of Europe, for he had not intended to create a work of art. All that he was making was a cooking pot, nothing but a cooking pot, such as a fellah or Bedouin can buy any day in any bazaar for a few copper coins. I knew the Greeks had created similar or even greater perfection. Probably in cooking pots as well, for they, too, water carrier and market porter, soldier and a potter, had truly shared in a culture that did not rest merely on the creative excitement of a few select individuals, on a few peaks which only men of genius could reach, but was common to all. Their pride in things beautiful, the things which were part of that culture, was part of their day-by-day doings as well, a continuous partaking in a joint, living possession. As I held that vessel in my hands, I knew, blessed are people who cook in such pots their daily meals, blessed are they whose claim to a cultural heritage is more than an empty boast. 4. Wilt thou not grant me the pleasure of dining with me now, O Muhammad? Amir ibn Musad's voice breaks through my reverie. I look up, and Damascus recedes into the past, where it belongs, and I am sitting once again on the bench by the side of the Amir of the North. The judicial session is apparently over, one by one the litigants depart. Ibn Musad rises, and his guests and men-at-arms rise with him. The throng of the Rajajal parts to make way for us. As we pass under the gateway they close their ranks and follow us into the castle yard. A little later, the Amir, Gadban ibn Rimal and myself sit down together at a meal consisting of a huge platter of rice with a whole roasted sheep on it. Besides us there are only two of the Emir's attendants and a pair of golden Saluki hounds in the room. Old Gadban lays his hand on my shoulder and says, "Thou hast not yet answered my question, no new wife yet?" I laugh at his persistence. I have a wife at Medina, as thou knowest. Why should I take another? Why? May God protect me. One wife and thou still a young man. Why, when I was thy age? I am told, interjects Amir ibn Musad, that thou dost not do so badly even now, O Sheikh Gadban. I am an old wreck, O Amir, may God lengthen thy life, but sometimes I need a young body to warm my old bones. But tell me, turning again to me, what about that Mutayri girl thou didst marry 2 years ago? What didst thou do with her? Why, nothing, and that's just the point, I reply. Nothing. Repeats the old man, his eyes wide open. Was she so ugly? No, on the contrary, she was very beautiful. What is it all about? Asks Ibn Musad. What Mutayri girl are you two talking about? Enlighten me, O Muhammad. And so I proceed to enlighten him about that marriage that led to nothing. I was then living at Medina, wifeless and lonely. A Bedouin from the tribe of Mutayr, Fahad was his name, used to spend hours every day in my kawa entertaining me with fantastic tales of his exploits under Lawrence during the Great War. One day he said to me, "It is not good for a man to live alone as thou dost, for thy blood will clot in thy veins, thou shouldst marry." and when I jokingly asked him to produce a prospective bride, he replied, "That's easy. The daughter of my brother-in-law, Muttrik, is now of marriageable age, and I, as her mother's brother, can tell thee that she is exceedingly beautiful." Still in a joking mood, I asked him to find out whether the father would be willing. And lo, next day Muttrik himself came to me, visibly embarrassed. After a few cups of coffee and some hemming and hawing, he finally told me that Fahad had spoken to him of my alleged desire to marry his daughter. "I would be honored to have thee for my son-in-law, but Ruqayya is still a child, she is only 11 years old." Fahad was furious when he heard of Muttrik's visit. The rascal! The lying rascal! The girl is 15 years old. He does not like the idea of marrying her to a non-Arab, but, on the other hand, he knows how close thou art to Ibn Saud and does not want to offend thee by an outright refusal, and so he pretends that she is still a child. "But I can tell thee, her breasts are like this," and he described with his hands a bosom of alluring proportions, just like pomegranates ready to be plucked. Old Gadban's eyes shimmer at this description, 15 years old, beautiful, and a virgin. And then, he says, "Nothing. What more couldst thou want than that?" Well, wait until I tell the rest of the story. I must admit that I was becoming more and more interested, and perhaps also a little bit spurred by Muttrik's resistance. I presented Fahad with 10 golden sovereigns and he did his best to persuade the girl's parents to give her to me in marriage. A similar gift went to her mother, Fahad's sister. What exactly happened in their house I do not know, all I know is that the two ultimately prevailed upon Muttrik to consent to the marriage. This Fahad, says Ibn Musaud, seems to have been a sly fellow. He and his sister were obviously expecting still greater bounty from thee. And what happened then? I go on telling them how the marriage was duly solemnized a few days later in the absence of the bride who, according to custom, was represented by her father as her legal guardian and bearer of her consent, the latter being testified to by 2 witnesses. A sumptuous wedding feast followed, with the usual gifts to the bride, whom I had never yet seen, her parents, and several other close relatives, among whom, naturally, Fahad figured most prominently. The same evening my bride was brought to my house by her mother and some other veiled females, while from the roofs of the neighboring houses women sang wedding songs to the accompaniment of hand drums. At the appointed hour I entered the room in which my bride and her mother were awaiting me. I was unable to distinguish the one from the other, for both were heavily covered in black, but when I uttered the words demanded by custom, "Thou mayest now retire," one of the 2 veiled ladies rose and silently left the room, and thus I knew that the one who had remained was my wife. And then, my son, what happened then? Prompts Ibn Rimmel as I pause at this stage of my narrative, and the Amir looks at me quizzically. Then, there she sat, the poor girl, obviously most terrified at having thus been delivered to an unknown man. And when I asked her, as gently as I knew how, to unveil her face, she only drew her abaya tighter about herself. "They always do that?" exclaims Ibn Rimmel. "They are always terrified at the beginning of the bridal night, and, moreover, it is becoming for a young girl to be modest. But afterward they are usually glad, wasn't thine?" Well, not quite. I had to remove her face veil myself. And when I had done so I beheld a girl of great beauty with an oval, wheat-colored face. Very large eyes and long tresses which hung down to the cushions on which she was sitting, but it was indeed the face of a child. She could not have been more than 11 years old, just as her father had claimed. Fahad's and his sister's greed had made them represent her to me as being of marriageable age, while poor Muttrik had been innocent of any lie. "So what?" asks Ibn Rimmel, obviously not understanding what I am driving at. What is wrong with 11 years? A girl grows up, doesn't she? And she grows up more quickly in a husband's bed. But Amir ibn Muzid says, no, Sheikh Gadban, he is not a Najdi like thee. He has more brains in his head. And, grinning at me, he continues, don't listen to Gadban, O Muhammad, he is a Najdi, and most of us Najdis have our brains not here, indicating his head, but here, and he points to quite another portion of his own anatomy. We all laugh, and Gadban mutters into his beard, then I certainly have more brains than thou hast, O Amir. At their urging, I go on with the story and tell them that, whatever old Gadban's views on the matter, the extreme youth of my child bride did not represent an extra bonus to me. I could feel no more than pity for the girl who had been made a victim of her uncle's mean stratagem. I treated her as one would treat a child, assuring her that she had nothing to fear from me, but she did not speak a word and her trembling betrayed her panic. Rummaging through a shelf, I found a piece of chocolate, which I offered her, but she, never having seen chocolate in her life, refused it with a violent shake of her head. I tried to put her at ease by telling her an amusing story from the Arabian Nights, but she did not even seem to grasp it, let alone find it funny. Finally she uttered her first words, my head is aching. I got hold of some aspirin tablets and thrust them into her hand with a glass of water. But this caused only a still more violent outbreak of terror. Only later did one learn that some of her women friends had told her that those strange people from foreign lands sometimes drugged their wives on their bridal night in order to rape them the more easily. After a couple of hours or so, I succeeded in convincing her that I had no aggressive designs. In the end she fell asleep like the child she was, while I made a bed for me on the carpet in a corner of the room. In the morning I sent for her mother and demanded that she take the girl home. The woman was stupefied. She had never heard of a man who refused so choice a morsel, an 11-year-old virgin, and must have thought that there was something radically wrong with me. And then? Asks Gadban. Nothing, I divorced the girl, having left her in the same state as she had come to me. It was not a bad deal for the family, who kept both the girl and the dower which I had paid, together with the many presents. As for myself, a rumor went around that there was no manhood in me and several well-wishers tried to persuade me that someone, perhaps a former wife, had cast a spell over me, from which I could only free myself by a counter-spell. When I think of thy subsequent marriage in Medina, O Muhammad, and thy son, says the Amir with a laugh, I am sure thou hast wrought a strong counter-spell. 5. Later at night, as I am about to go to bed in the room put at my disposal, I find Zaid more silent than usual. He stands near the doorway, visibly lost in some distant thoughts, his chin resting on his breast and his eyes fixed on the blue and moss-green medallion of the Khurasan carpet that covers the floor. How does it feel, Zaid, to be back in the town of thy youth after all these years? For in the past he has always refused to enter Hale whenever I had occasion to visit it. I am not sure, O my uncle, he replies slowly. 11 years. It is 11 years since I was here last. Thou knowest that my heart would not let me come here earlier and behold the people of the south ruling in the palace of Ibn Rashid. But of late I have been telling myself, in the words of the book, O God, Lord of sovereignty. Thou givest sovereignty to whom thou pleasest and takest away sovereignty from whom thou pleasest. Thou exaltest whom thou pleasest and abasest whom thou pleasest. In thy hand is all the good, and thou hast power over all things. No doubt, God gave sovereignty to the house of Ibn Rashid, but they did not know how to use it rightly. They were bountiful to their people but hard on their own kin and reckless in their pride. They spilled blood. Brother killing brother, and so, God took away their rule and handed it back to Ibn Saud. I think I should not grieve any longer, for is it not written in the book, sometimes you love a thing, and it may be the worst for you, and sometimes you hate a thing, and it may be the best for you? There is a sweet resignation in Zaid's voice, a resignation implying no more than the acceptance of something that has already happened and cannot therefore be undone. It is this acquiescence of the Muslim spirit to the immutability of the past, the recognition that whatever has happened had to happen in this particular way and could have happened in no other, that is so often mistaken by Westerners for a fatalism inherent in the Islamic outlook. But a Muslim's acquiescence to fate relates to the past and not to the future. It is not a refusal to act, to hope, and to improve, but a refusal to consider past reality as anything but an act of God. And beyond that, continues Zaid, Ibn Saud has not behaved badly toward the Shamar. They know it, nor did they not support him with their swords 3 years ago when that dog ad-Daesh rose against him. They did indeed, with the magnanimity of the vanquished so characteristic of true Arabs at their best. In that fateful year, 1929. When Ibn Saud's kingdom shook to its very foundations under the blows of the great Bedouin revolt led by Faisal ad-Daesh. All the Shamar tribes living in Najd put aside their one-time animosity toward the king, rallied around him and contributed largely to his subsequent victory over the rebels. This reconciliation was truly remarkable. For it had been only a few years earlier that Ibn Saud had conquered Hale by force of arms and thus re-established the hegemony of the south over the north. And the more remarkable in view of the age-old mutual dislike, which goes deeper than any dynastic struggle for power, between the tribe of Shamar and the people of southern Najd, of whom Ibn Saud is one. To a large extent, this antipathy, which even the recent reconciliation has not entirely eradicated, is an expression of the traditional rivalry between North and South that goes through the entire history of the Arabs and has its counterpart in many other nations as well. For it often happens that a small difference in the inner rhythm of life produces more hostility between closely related tribes than racial strangeness could cause between entirely different neighboring nations. Apart from political rivalry, another factor plays a considerable role in the emotional divergencies between the Arabian North and South. It was in the south of Najd, in the vicinity of Riyadh, that nearly 200 years ago the Puritan reformer, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, rose and stirred the tribes, then Muslims in name only, to a new religious enthusiasm. It was in the then insignificant house of Ibn Saud, chieftains of the small township of Diariya, that the reformer gained the iron arm which gave the force of action to his inspiring word, and within a few decades, gathered a large part of the peninsula within that glowing, uncompromising movement of faith known as Wahhabism. In all the Wahhabi wars and conquests of the last 150 years, it was always the people of the South who carried aloft the banners of Puritanism, while the North only half-heartedly went along with them, for although the Shamar share the Wahhabi tenets in theory, their hearts have remained remote from the fiery, unyielding religious persuasion of the South. Living close to the borderlands, Syria and Iraq, and always connected with them by trade, the Shamar have in the course of ages acquired a suave laxity of outlook and a readiness for compromise quite unknown to the more isolated Southerners. The men of the South know only extremes, and for the last century and a half they have known nothing but dreams of jihad, proud, haughty men who regard themselves as the only true representatives of Islam and all other Muslim peoples as heretics. With all this, the Wahhabis are certainly not a separate section. A sect would presuppose the existence of certain separate doctrines which would distinguish its followers from the great mass of all the other followers of the same faith. In Wahhabism, however, there are no separate doctrines. On the contrary, this movement has made an attempt to do away with all the accretions and superimposed doctrines which in the course of many centuries have grown up around the original teachings of Islam, and to return to the pristine message of the Prophet. In its uncompromising clarity, this was certainly a great attempt, which in time could have led to a complete freeing of Islam from all the superstitions that have obscured its message. Indeed, all the Renaissance movements in modern Islam, the Al-Hadith movement in India, the Sanusi movement in North Africa, the work of Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and the Egyptian Muhammad Abda, can be directly traced back to the spiritual impetus set in motion in the 18th century by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. But the Najdi development of his teachings suffers from two defects which have prevented it from becoming a force of spiritual destiny. One of these defects is the narrowness with which it seeks to confine almost all religious endeavors to a literal observation of injunctions, overlooking the need for penetrating to their spiritual content. The other defect is rooted in the Arab character itself, in that zealotic, self-righteous orientation of feeling which concedes to no one the right to differ, an attitude as peculiar to the true Semite as its diametrical opposite, complete laxity in matters of faith. It is a tragic quality of the Arabs that they must always swing between two poles and never can find a middle way. Once upon a time, hardly 2 centuries ago, the Arabs of Najd were innerly more distant from Islam than any other group in the Muslim world, while ever since the advent of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab they have regarded themselves not merely as champions of the faith but almost as its sole owners. The spiritual meaning of Wahhabism, the striving after an inner renewal of Muslim society, was corrupted almost at the same moment when its outer goal, the attainment of social and political power, was realized with the establishment of the Saudi kingdom at the end of the 18th century and its expansion over the larger part of Arabia early in the 19th. As soon as the followers of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab achieved power, his idea became a mummy, for the spirit cannot be a servant of power, and power does not want to be a servant of the spirit. The history of Wahhab Najd is the history of a religious idea which first rose on the wings of enthusiasm and longing and then sank down into the lowlands of Pharisaic self-righteousness. For all virtue destroys itself as soon as it ceases to be longing and humility, harut, marut,